Hey everybody, it's Cartoon 12.
And now for something completely different.
So some of you may or may not be familiar with a YouTuber by the name of the mysterious Mr. Enter, who has a lengthy backlog of videos reviewing all manner of animation, both good and bad. Every once in a while on his Admirable Animation segment, he'll put together a compilation of mini reviews about outstanding animations from the web, and it inspired me to try and do something similar. By that I mean I want to discuss a topic that I don't think gets talked about enough: fan fiction. Plenty of people are passionate about their fandoms and express themselves in various ways, whether it's with drawings, or making music videos, or diving into full-length analogies and debates and theories in chat rooms for hours. But one corner of fandom expression that's arguably just as big, but that few seem to highlight as much, is fanfic. And I can't really understand why. Okay, correction, I sort of can. Fanfic tends to be a thing that many people get made fun of for, and the general conception seems to be that all fanfic is just poorly written erotica or self-inserts or filled with Mary Sue-ish original characters.
You may want to thank your fans after tonight, Daniel, because they may be giving you your next film.
Okay.
Yeah, because there is a website called Simply Daniel Radcliffe Fan Fiction, okay?
Okay.
And what happens, this one's called Cabin Fever, okay? Here's the plot synopsis. Maggie is the president of her own clothing line, Mystique Clothing. She's taking some time off for a summer vacation. When she shows up, Daniel Radcliffe has taken her cabin. Now they have to share the cabin. Maggie doesn't like him at all. Like Michael Fassbender's a powerful man with powerful enemies. He asked the agency for the best they had. They sent him James McAvoy. So, yeah. Bring some of them out. Would you mind reading?
Now look, I'm not going to stand here and try to pretend those sorts of stories don't exist, because yeah, they do. I'm also not going to say that those sorts of stories are inherently bad, because they're not. As long as it's not harming anyone, there's nothing wrong with shameless indulgence. But what I am saying is that that's not all there is to it. I wish I could have taken Graham Norton and those actors and shown them how many more stories there are that are truly tear-jerking and incredibly written, and dive into aspects of a fandom's respective show or book or movie that the main media didn't cover or didn't have time to cover. And for me, that's partly what fan fiction should be, but really it can be anything and everything. It's the writing equivalent to a fan taking their action figures and playing in a sandbox, coming up with new stories for the characters they love. Want to see your favorite characters get together? Write it. Angry with the character being unreasonably killed off? Fix it. Wonder what it would be like if your favorite show took place in another time period? It's alternate universe time. Want to see two totally different fandoms meet each other? Crossover. Have some crazy theory about a character and why they act the way they do? Time to explore that in a story that was supposed to be a one-shot but blew up into a multi-chapter epic. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Go on fanfiction.net or Archive of Our Own and search hard enough and you'll find some true diamonds in the rough. And in my case, many of them. For this video, I'm going to take you through a small sampling of some of my personal favorite fan fiction stories and highlight just how creative and awesome a fandom can be, to the point that sometimes the fans have concocted a better story, arguably, than the actual show it's based off of. I'm sort of going to be doing this in the style of my top 10 countdown list, although this time around, even though I'm highlighting 10, they're not going to be in any particular order. I tried to have as much variety as I could here, and tried to include a different fandom for each entry, so there's a little of something here for everyone. I'll also try my best to hold back on the spoilers, but admittedly some of these stories I can't really discuss without revealing some of the best parts, so when necessary I'll give ample spoiler warnings. This is also the first time I've discussed literature in depth in a video, so get ready to see a lot of still images. Think of this as sort of a part countdown / part essay / part discussion about fanfic and why it's just as important in fandom. The links for all these stories will be in the description box below, and who knows, if this video does well enough, maybe I'll do this again sometime, because Lord knows I got plenty of fanfics I could talk about, and it was tricky picking out just 10. So without further ado, let's dive in. Let's kick things off with probably the oldest story on this list, Strangers on a Train by Jen K. If you grew up with the original trilogy of Spider-Man movies, then you remember the train fight between Spidey and Doc Ock in the second film. In one of the film's most pivotal scenes, Peter is left unmasked as the passengers from the train help him after he passes out, then try to defend him when Doc Ock comes back for him. But let's think. Pretty much a whole train car full of people saw what Spider-Man really looks like. So, what do you do with this information? What happened to these people afterward? And what would happen if they ever ran into Spidey again when he's in his civvies? These are the questions this fic intends to answer as we're taken through 12 short stories in which various passengers from the ill-fated train all have chance encounters with Peter Parker sometime later. Each character is fleshed out fairly well in a short amount of time as we learn why they were each on the train that day, how the Spider-Man incident changed their lives, and most importantly, why they decide to keep it secret. From a homeless man to a wannabe actress to a cancer patient to a doctor to the two little kids who gave Peter his mask back to a girl with mutant powers to a kid from Peter's class, every character has a unique story, voice, and personality, and though all of them are affected in different ways, they all come to a unanimous decision to keep quiet about what they saw, and they all have their various reasons. For me personally, the chapter that stands out to me the most, besides the one with the mutant girl that was no doubt referencing the recent X-Men movies at the time, and remember, this was years before the concept of a shared universe came to be, the story that's my favorite is the one involving a mob boss. One of the passengers is a high-ranking crime lord, and upon seeing Peter's face, at first he can't believe his luck and starts scheming of how he's going to take advantage of this opportunity, but after some second thoughts, he too keeps his mouth shut. Why? You'll just have to read and find out. Ilya couldn't believe his luck. He had survived so long in the world of crime, just a few months from retirement, only to be fated for death because of the quarrel between a madman and a stubborn idealist. Doc Ock abandoned the ill-fated train, but Ilya was surprised as he watched Spider-Man risk his life to save the passengers. He had heard stories about this man's compassion, but Ilya didn't believe it until then. He had seen too much of the world to believe that anyone risked their own life on a daily basis with no hope of compensation. There were no good people in this world, or so Ilya had thought. While risking his life, he had been unmasked, revealing his face and identity to all those he had just saved. He was just a boy, younger than Ilya's own son, Alexei. Yet he had been willing to die in his effort to save people he didn't even know. Perhaps there were good, honest people in the world, however few they might be. This is a great example of filling in some of the blanks the movie left out and giving some of the nameless background characters a voice and personality, and the ending is a really funny and sweet little twist that I dare not spoil. Speaking of funny and sweet, let's talk about what's probably my favorite holiday-themed fic of all time. The one simply titled Happy Holidays by Jay Mackenzie. Out of all the Star Trek series, the original remains my favorite, and though the fandom may be old, stories are still being written about it to this day. In fact, some argue that it's because of the original Trek that fanfiction got its start to begin with, so it's only fitting that a Trek-related story makes its way here. In this, Christmas time is coming up in just a few days, so the Enterprise crew is celebrating the holidays in various ways however they can. Unsurprisingly, Spock is the odd one out, so a couple crew members decide to try and get him into the holiday spirit, going so far as to sneak into his quarters and decorate it with an explosion of gaudy decorations. At 5 chapters, it's fairly short. You can breeze through it in about an hour, but the writing is excellent and everyone's in character, to the point that I can easily hear their voices in my head as I read it. It captures the good spirit and cheeky humor the show could have on occasion really well. It makes me wish that this were an actual episode, though I'm not sure how well that would have turned out, since this is a slice of life story with no villain or huge conflict at all, unless you count a tiny subplot where the ship's computers mysteriously start malfunctioning, an event that Spock believes is connected to the mystery of who broke into his quarters and redecorated it. But that's what I can appreciate about this. Not every show's holiday-themed episode has to be some epic, we gotta save X holiday thing. This could have easily become some deep emotional piece about about why Spock does or does not celebrate certain Earth holidays, and of course I like those kinds of stories too, but I like the author's deliberate choice here to keep things simple and lighthearted. I could easily see this being aired as a half-hour Christmas special or something. The doctor flared up at once. "I'll thank you not to tell me how to practice medicine, Spock." Spock folded himself into a chair. "Perhaps you require further schooling, as your advice seems faulty." Clenching his teeth to prevent himself from saying something he'd regret, the doctor snapped. "Did you come in here to criticize me, Spock, or is there something you need?" "My intention was not to criticize," Spock claimed. "My purpose is to ask you a few questions if it will not interrupt your schedule." The doctor's eyes glinted hopefully. "If I said it would be interfering with my schedule, would you leave?" "Yes," Spock answered. "Then I'm busy," McCoy announced firmly. Overall, this is a well-written slice of holiday cheer that I find myself rereading at some point every Christmas. Does the crew succeed in getting Spock in the mood for the holidays? Well, kind of. I won't spoil the ending, but it'll put a huge grin on your face. Next up is The Artist by Kenya Starflight. I guess you'd consider this a Star Wars story, although really it's unlike anything else I've ever read, with a plot that's incredibly weird but memorable for its uniqueness. It centers on a grade school age kid named Devin who's constantly being bullied, mostly because of his huge love of geeky things, namely Star Wars. The story opens as he's attempting to outrun said bullies, to which he winds up discovering a Star Wars themed hobby shop when he takes refuge there. He then meets the elderly store owner, and the two become friends, with Devin stopping by every day to help clean the shop. One of the things he's most curious about is the photorealistic paintings that Mr. Masakato has dotted around the store. Paintings of all the popular characters from the Star Wars franchise, up to the release of the prequel films, that is, as of the time of the writing. But soon enough, Devin discovers that there's more to the shop in these paintings than anyone would think possible when a gang of thieves breaks into the store and damages the paintings, after which something magical happens. They all paused. There was indeed a strange noise in the shop, a rhythmic, airy sound, like air being let out of a tire in measured bursts, only lower, an ominous hish-whoosh that sent shivers of fright up Devin's spine as his mind placed the sound. Turning, he saw blinking lights in the darkness by the cash register. Heavy footsteps pulsed as a tall figure stepped into the moonlight that spilled in through the shattered door. Blue-white light eerily highlighted the sinister ebony mask, the gleaming shoulder and chest armor, the shin greaves and thick gauntlets. A night-black cloak trailed after him like a set of wings. Devin swallowed. Things couldn't get any worse. Someone whimpered as 6 more figures emerged from the shadows. Their armor gleamed bone white in the watery light, their forever frowning helmets regarding the intruders detachedly. Their black-gloved hands clutched wicked-looking blaster rifles that gave no indication of being just for show. Devin tried to swallow again, but had no spit left to do so. Things had just gotten worse. Lord Darth Vader gazed contemptuously down at the gangsters.
"I do not believe you are authorized to be here at this hour,"
he noted, his voice resonant and metallic, as dark and foreboding as the rest of him. Yep, as it turns out, the paintings are supernatural, and when you tear up, burn up, or otherwise destroy them, the characters depicted in the picture appear in real life. How imaginative and awesome is that? I really don't want to spoil any more of the plot. You really should just go and read it for yourself. All I'll say is that it eventually leads to discussions about lost worlds, alternate realities, and the act of storytelling and making characters come to life. There's 3 chapters / acts in all, with the other 2 parts getting more fandoms involved, from Harry Potter to Star Trek to Shrek and the Never-Ending Story. Yeah, like I said, this story gets enjoyably weird. Admittedly, though, the other 2 acts aren't as great as the first, at least to me. The author's writing style has changed and improved greatly over the years, and it's very obvious this is an earlier work of hers, since the descriptions aren't as detailed as they are now. And the other 2 acts, while still having some cool moments, feel more like a semi-forced continuation of the story, when the first act pretty much stood well enough on its own. I'm often tempted to ask the author if she'll ever reconsider rewriting this story someday with the skills she has now, but on the other hand, it's probably better to just leave well enough alone. It's nice to go back and look at your old work and see how much you improved over time. And even if this story is arguably just a bit dated, the first act is well worth the read, and it still stands as the most interesting fic idea I've ever come across. On the subject of crossovers, let's take a quick look at another one of this same author's works, one that I knew I had to feature, Ghost Jets. According to the author, this won a writing contest at a local convention, and it's easy to see why. How many people would be inspired by an interview with voice actor Frank Welker, who provided the voice for both Megatron and Fred Jones, to pen a crossover between Scooby-Doo and the Transformers? And for how many celebrities and other cartoons that Mystery Inc. has crossed paths with, I'm super surprised this meeting hasn't happened yet. It all starts when Scooby and the gang are called in to investigate a series of disturbances at a power plant, incidents that involve ghostly noises and glowing white jets with no pilots flying overhead. The gang is pretty stumped until stuff like this happens. Shaggy opened his mouth to bite into his half of the sandwich, then paused, remembering something. "Hey, Scoobs, pass the ketchup, will ya?" The bottle appeared at his side and he accepted it. "Thanks." "No problem." Shaggy paused. He knew he wasn't exactly the smartest member of Mr. Inc., but he knew for a fact that voice wasn't Scooby. Not to mention Scooby was sitting on his left, but the ketchup bottle had come from his right. Turning slowly in place, he brought himself face to face with two robots who were seated just 4 feet away from Shaggy and Scooby. Each was slightly taller than the average human, with scarlet visors covering their eyes and foreheads. Their faces were of smooth silver metal, and their chests bore markings and indentations that made them closely resemble cassette tapes. The closest one, a violet and blue robot, met Shaggy's puzzled stare with a bemused look of his own, as if just realizing who was beside him. A cup of something pinkish purple frozen halfway on its way to his mouth. The other, red and black, appeared to be pouring himself a drink of the same stuff from a cube-shaped container, but seeing as he was also taken up with staring at Shaggy, the liquid was overflowing his mug and spilling onto the table. The stunned silence on everyone's part lasted a good 2 seconds. Then Scooby howled in terror, Shaggy gave a scream of his own, and the two tore off, abandoning the remains of the sandwich. Frenzy punched his brother in the arm. "Smart move, Rumble, real smart. Take an energon break, you said. The kitchen's probably deserted, you said. No one will be the wiser, you said." He punctuated each sentence with another blow. "Slag off already," Rumble shouted, grabbing the other cassette's arm to ward off another punch. "Come on, we gotta catch those organics before they blow our cover." Moments like this pepper the entire story that plays out exactly like an episode of the classic series on both sides. Scooby-Doo is pretty much unchanging, but as for the Transformers side of things, this is one scenario that can arguably only happen in the G1 universe, which is the version used here. I would pay to have the voice actors perform a dramatic reading of this, or have some really skilled team of fans make this a full-blown animation. Nothing would be better than seeing Fred taking on Megatron and the Mystery Machine, or hearing the Decepticons say the classic, "And I would have gotten away with it too if it weren't for you meddling kids." Shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the problem I have with family movies, or more specifically, their trailers. So often a kids and or family film will come out and the trailer only includes the most juvenile jokes and slapstick moments to appeal to kids, making the movie look corny or stupider than it actually might be. Perfect example is Earth to Echo, a movie that I only gave a glance because of positive word of mouth, and it turned out to be, in my opinion, one of the most underrated films of the decade. I say all of this because there was another movie that shares the same situation. A series of films, actually. A trilogy that I dismissed back when it came out, only to finally give it a chance in recent years, and was kicking myself for what I missed out on. That, of course, is the Night at the Museum franchise. Seriously, why do people not talk about these movies more? It has a unique story, a great mix of historical figures for its characters, people of color actually being played by people of color, Mickey Rooney and Robin Williams in their final film roles, may they rest in peace, and a constant level of quality that lasted through all three movies in terms of plot, characters, and humor. Had this series come out in the early to mid 90s, I could totally see these films spinning off into a Saturday morning cartoon show detailing the further adventures of the museum crew. Hey, if Ace Ventura and The Mask could do it, anyone can do it. Well, while an animated series will probably never happen, here's a story that gives us a taste of what a TV show could be like. A Treasured Collection by Oddments and Tweaks is exactly what the title says. It's a collection of stories and other misadventures as Larry the Night Watchman tries to take care of the museum. Pretty much every character gets a spotlight chapter or moment at some point, and the author clearly did her research on the historical facts about each character. Facts that either play heavily into the plots or develop the characters more. In particular, Amen-Ra, who we slowly learn more background information about in bits and pieces as it becomes important, like his troubled history with his older brother and a brief time when he was allowed to walk around back in World War II. Not to mention all the various lessons that Larry and his son Nicky pick up from their museum friends. It all accumulates into one of my favorite chapters from the anthology, in which a gang of thieves breaks into the museum, to which Larry and company have to defend the building Home Alone style. Everyone gets a moment to shine, and it is awesome. Sacagawea faced her new attacker with a snarl of disgust, bow drawn, eyes narrowing as she advanced on him. He didn't frighten her. The leader of the gang was pointing a handgun at the Shoshone woman. "Good God, man, what are you doing, aiming a weapon at a woman?" Teddy made a move in front of her. "Fine, you want me to aim at you? Done." The man fired. Teddy looked annoyed. "This was an excellent replica costume, I'll have you know. Now what are you doing here in my museum, assaulting my friends and threatening my lady?" At each "my," the leader had squeezed the trigger. By the time Teddy had reached the now horrified man, he had 4 bullet holes in his chest and looked positively thunderous. What are you? Thoroughly disappointed with your conduct and marksmanship." Knocking the gun from the man's shaking hands, Teddy proceeded to educate him on the finer points of martial conduct. In other words, he beat the stuffing out of him. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Unfortunately, this anthology is also the prime example of another trope that can sometimes plague fan fiction: an unfinished story. The last chapter left off on a bit of a cliffhanger, and it's been a few years since the story was last updated, so in some ways it is kind of bittersweet, but better to have an incredibly well-written story that's incomplete than none at all. Hopefully someday the author will return and finish the anthology, but until then, there's plenty of short stories throughout this collection that you can enjoy in separate chunks. Trust me when I say that, despite technically being incomplete, it's well worth it. Getting back to crossovers, here's something I failed to mention earlier. Oftentimes, some of the best crossovers are the ones that manage to give just enough information so that the audience from either fandom won't be lost. Great example is The Dream of Unbreaking by YT1, which decided to take Samurai Jack and have him meet this one character that can easily be crossed over with anything: Neil Gaiman's Sandman. When I first discovered this story, I knew plenty about Jack, but knew Jack about Sandman. But the way the story plays out, I could easily follow along and understand what was going on for the most part. If you don't know anything about Dream and the Endless, you can just treat these people as another batch of odd characters that Jack runs into on his quest, and still pretty much get what's going on. The story starts off with Jack having just endured a battle with a monster, resulting in his sword shockingly being broken. What kind of monster this was and how it managed to break his magic sword when even Aku can't do it is never explained, and that's probably the only negative I can say about this, but honestly, it's not really that important. The whole real point is that Jack has lost all hope of fulfilling his quest to get back home. That is, until a mysterious stranger appears who claims that he can help Jack repair his sword. Turns out this stranger is Destruction, one of the entities that make up the Endless. From there, he enlists the help of his brother Dream to gather the materials they'll need to repair the sword. Materials that can only be found in the dreaming realm, and in one's own soul. Destruction walked around the pool to the helmet hanging on the far wall. It looked like the head of some huge, strange insect with shining green eyes. Destruction regarded it carefully for some time, as if locked into a staring contest with those eyes. If he did what he was planning to do, it was going to be something of a problem. He would have to move again, and he'd just gotten used to things here. Maybe he shouldn't, but he realized he had to. It was important. If he didn't do something, he would certainly regret it later. He took the helm down from the wall, held it in his hands, and spoke the words. Dream of the endless. I stand in my gallery and I hold your sigil. Will you come to me? No turning back now. I am here, brother. It has been some time since we last met. Destruction turned and looked to the speaker who was standing to the right of him. The man was tall and thin, with skin the color of snow and wild hair of the same color. His eyes, or what he had instead of eyes, were twin pools of night, their pupils distant twinkling stars. He wore a flowing robe of white silk that blew in a non-existent breeze, and in the folds of it flames and rainbows flickered. An emerald pendant hung on a silver chain about his neck. He looked to be in his teens or early 20s, but in truth he was older than even Destruction, and Destruction was old even before the earth itself had been born. He greeted his brother. It's good to see you again, too. How are things going in your realm? All is well with me, but I know you did not call me here for mere pleasantries. Dream looked around the room, then back at his brother. Are you planning to return to us? His tone of voice said that he hoped it was so, but knew that it wasn't. You know the answer, Destruction said. I'm sorry. He hung the mask on the wall again. His brother's gaze dropped to the floor for a moment. For what purpose, then, have you called me here? I'll show you, said Destruction by way of explanation. He went to the bronze door and opened it, then walked through it. His brother followed behind. Once they had both left the room, Destruction closed the little wooden door and locked it. He moved to the stairs and began to climb them. Although his footsteps made the boards creak, his brother's feet made no sound at all. Destruction put his hand on the knob of the guest room door, then put a finger to his lips for quiet. He edged the door open slowly and nodded at the person sleeping in the bed. You know who he is, don't you? Of course, Dream answered him. He watched as Destruction padded into the room and picked up the sword from its stool. He offered it to his brother for inspection. Dream took it and drew the weapon from its scabbard. He looked at it carefully. You see why I called you, Destruction whispered. That stuff is in your realm, not mine. Dream slid the sword back into its scabbard. I understand your concern. This is a most serious problem. Since then, I've read up on plenty of Sandman stories, and of course that helps me to appreciate this crossover all the more. As the author says in the introduction, this is a rather unconventional Jack story. You can cross Sandman with almost anything, but when you do, it tends to take your original idea and run amok with it. That causes some weird and wonderful things to happen, and I couldn't agree more. Who knows what evil lurks in the minds of men? And who knows how many people watching this video actually saw this movie, but this story is awesome and I want to talk about it. So do you guys remember my top 10 favorite superheroes video a while back? If you haven't, go ahead and pause this, go watch it, then come back, because the hero in the number 10 slot is the subject of this little section as well. The Shadow is arguably one of the coolest and most famous pulp heroes of all time, next to maybe Flash Gordon, and I was introduced to him primarily through the 1994 movie, a film that is criminally underrated. But thankfully, someone out there shares my love for this movie, because this author has written a ton of stories for the Shadow alone. But out of all of them, this one's my favorite. Absolution by Scarlet involves a murder victim being discovered in a Catholic church, to which the Shadow has to figure out who the man was and why he was killed. But as the investigation wears on and starts to hit too close to home, Lamont must confront all the horrible memories of the terrible things he's done in his past, and wonders if he's truly atoning for all his sins. And meanwhile, the church's priest, who was the last person to see the victim alive, and who may also have some special abilities of his own, refuses to disclose the man's last words. Tolku loved tea. He always had a cauldron of something brewing over the fireplace in his chamber. When he had a sick or injured student, he'd bring them to his chamber, put them in his own bed, and spend hours and days taking care of them, feeding them, giving them soothing cups of whatever tea he happened to make that day. He smiled at the memory. The only tea I never developed a taste for was butter tea. I just didn't like the oiliness of it. It was his favorite tea, though, but if I was in there, he'd brew something else. He opened the pot and dipped the infuser up and down a few times and poured tea for the both of them. She sat in the leather armchair and smiled up at him. He must have loved you a lot. He sat across from her on the chasse lounge. He had depths of kindness and generosity with him that I'll never understand, let alone ever possess. Of course, whenever I would say that, he would scold me and tell me I was being too hard on myself. No matter what I'd said or done, no matter how disrespectful or stubborn I'd been that day, he could always look through the darkness past the man I was to find the man I could be. He looked at his teacup, trying to keep his bubbling emotions down. She walked over to him and put a gentle hand on his shoulder. He was the first person who'd ever forgiven you for what you'd done, even though you couldn't forgive yourself. He nodded and forced himself to look up at her. And until I met you, the only one. This case is really getting to you, isn't it? The whole idea of having to deal with a priest, having to face those things you can't forgive yourself for, it's really turning you inside out. I can feel it. He looked at his tea again. I live every day of my life with the knowledge that I committed unspeakable crimes against humanity. I committed them, not Yinko, Lamont Cranston. A sip of tea to calm his emotions. The Tolku told me I would never be able to rid myself of that darkness, that I had to learn to live with it, acknowledge its existence, use it to drive me onward as a reminder of the price of failure. And for the most part, that's what I do. But just when I get comfortable with myself, thinking that I've got everything under control, something just comes out of the blue and kicks me in the teeth. And all those old feelings of revulsion and horror come right back up to the surface, and I start battling with my dark side all over again. To say this story is nothing short of a masterpiece is an understatement. The plot is incredibly well thought out, with plenty of twists and turns, and dialogue that sounds exactly as if it were pulled straight from the movie. The established characters are developed much further than the film's runtime could take it, such as the scene I just read, or moments where Lamont's girlfriend, Margot Lane, begins developing her own psychic powers more. This is also probably one of the best examples of the inclusion of an original character. In this case, it's the priest, Father Mark Ryan, who's very likable, well-developed, and helps to put Lamont's fears and internal pain to rest. As for the role he plays in helping to solve the murder mystery, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but let's just say that Lamont and Margot aren't the only ones with special powers. You'll just have to read and find out. While we're on the subject of more obscure fandoms, let's talk about one that I didn't even know had fan fiction attached to it. Gilligans Island. As you've probably noticed, I like older shows as well, and one day while watching some episodes, I was in a mood, and I guess you could say my weird curiosity made me go, I wonder if anyone's written anything for this show. Didn't take me long to discover that, yes, shockingly enough, this quirky little show about a band of castaways is a tiny niche carved in the fan fiction world. Even more shocking is how recently some of them were written. The newest ones dated up to 2017. I guess let it be known that in the world of fanfic, no piece of media is too outdated to be talked about. But anyway, out of the entire section, None So Blind by Chill 13 is easily the best story. One that plays out exactly like an episode with perfect characterization and a plot that not only should have been the series finale, but actually went so far as to change nearly my entire perspective on the show itself. The story begins with both Gilligan and the Professor writing in their respective diaries with a noteworthy detail that the Professor is recovering from a broken leg. The rest of the story is in a massive flashback as we go back and see what led up to this point, with Gilligan and the Professor's diary entries acting as the framing device as they go back and forth explaining to the audience what happened. The author gets their respective voices down perfectly to the point that it's very easy to tell when we're switching between the characters. The Professor's entries are very studious and detailed, using big words and reading like a school textbook, while Gilligan's entries use much simpler wording to the point that many words are misspelled. A detail that at first I thought was a fault of the author, but turns out was done on purpose for a rather important reason that we'll get to in a second. The actual plot is that Gilligan is his usual clumsy self and accidentally wrecks a portion of the camp, after which the Professor wants to do some scientific research on the island and offers to take Gilligan with him. One, because he needs a helping hand, and two, to keep him away from the camp for a while since the rest of the cast castaways are basically ready to give him a beating by that point. One thing leads to another, and after believing they're being pursued by headhunters, Gilligan and the professor wind up accidentally falling off a cliff and landing in a ravine of sorts. They could climb out, but the professor can't because of his now messed up leg, and Gilligan refuses to leave his injured friend behind, so the two are now stuck there until the morning. Throughout their little adventure, their conversations the two have are both interesting and develop their characters, from learning more about their backstories to what their real names are to the reasons why the castaways never tried building a boat. It even goes so far as to reveal that both Gilligan and the professor actually secretly like living on the island, the professor because of all the discoveries he's making, and Gilligan because he finds the place peaceful and has come to see the castaways as his family, so much so that he's afraid to reveal his feelings to any of them because he's afraid that they'll think he's purposely trying to sabotage their chances of being rescued, which couldn't be further from the truth. But then, while the two are stuck in the hole and having an interesting heart-to-heart, Gilligan unknowingly reveals something about himself that instantly changed everything for me. A theory I would have never thought of but makes perfect sense. I've tried to keep this video fairly spoiler-free, but this is the one instance where I just can't talk about why I love this story so much without giving away the twist. So if you don't want to be spoiled, stop the video and go read the story first, then come back, or skip to the timestamp indicated here. Otherwise, here we go. They kept telling me everything I did was backwards. They thought I was trying to be funny, but I wasn't. Backwards? I asked, intrigued. Some of Gilligan's logic and actions could be described with that word, but by the context, it didn't seem that that's what he meant. The letters, they were all backwards and mixed up. Nothing looked like they said it should. Even my art teacher flunked me. She said I couldn't draw my way out of a paper bag. He shook his head. I don't understand how the other kids learned to read so easy. I tried just as hard, I really did. He gave a melancholy sigh. I learned eventually, but I'm still not as good as everyone else. It was an epiphany. I was overcome, struck speechless by the unexpected revelation. How could I have been so blind? As I stared at him, his cap glowing in the faint illumination, I realized that I had been looking at the young man in the wrong light all these years. Gilligan had perfectly described the symptoms of dyslexia, a condition caused by the failure of the brain to establish hemispheric dominance, resulting in extreme difficulty comprehending the written word, also called word blindness. I had always suspected that Gilligan's educational deficiency was due to lack of academic enthusiasm on his part. How could I have misjudged him so severely? I felt like a failure, both as a scientist and a friend. As a man of science, I always dig deeper, trying to understand the true nature of things around me. How then could I have passed sentence on a human being, a friend, simply by outward appearances? A disability with the written word is anything but Gilligan's fault. That difficulty, I realized, would have made learning any other subject arduous as well, since modern education relies heavily on textbooks. No wonder his knowledge of history and literature is lacking. I loved reading since I was a child, and I can scarcely imagine going through life with a difficulty in something so basic, and yet Gilligan had. I couldn't help but think of how much he must have missed. So much knowledge of the amazing world we live in and how it works. Great works of literature, the marvelous accomplishments of world history. Why had I not seen it before? I should have seen it before. All the signs were right there under my nose. His faulty spelling, his affection for comic books, a form of entertainment that's mostly visual with minimal reading required, his poor hand-eye coordination. Then another thought hit me. But you were in the Navy. You must have graduated high school. This was a feat that moments before I had thought nothing of, but now realizing the boy's struggle, I found myself struck with a tremendous admiration. Gilligan sighed. Just barely, with a D average. They said they'd pass me if I just showed up every day. His voice was a bit quieter as he spoke again. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if I really am as dumb as everyone says. I grabbed his arm and he started. Gilligan, you're not dumb. And there you have it, folks. The reason Gilligan is such a klutz is because he has dyslexia. When I first read this, I was as stunned as the professor. It's so easy to write off Gilligan as a stereotypical, bumbling, clumsy, dopey comic relief, but to suddenly give this serious explanation for why he is the way he is, and more importantly for it to make perfect sense, is mind-blowing. Even more genius is how the author has Gilligan's diary entries purposely misspelled, a little detail that cleverly hints at the big reveal early on, but that I didn't quite pick up on until I went back and reread it. Never has reading a fanfic ever affected me so much as this one, because now as I go back and rewatch the series, I can never quite look at it in the same light ever again. All the times that Gilligan ever gets his directions confused or has his usual pratfalls, now thinking about it through this new lens, suddenly his slapstick isn't quite so funny anymore, is it? Do I still enjoy the show? Of course I do. I'm just saying this one story gave me a completely new perspective on an otherwise lighthearted comedy, and judging by how all the castaways changed their tune about Gilligan by the story's end, honestly, this should have been the series finale. In just a short 6 chapters, it develops the castaways farther than the series ever did, and takes 2 characters that seem like total opposites, but turn out to have more in common than they thought. None so blind indeed. Speaking of blind, let's shift focus to one more fandom for our final 2 stories. We started the list with an older fandom, so let's end it off with a more recent one. I've been following the Marvel Cinematic Universe since its inception, and that includes the many TV shows that have branched out from it. Mainly the ones streaming on Netflix. For this new movement, the superhero they chose to be their flagship character was Daredevil, one of Marvel's more underrated but still interesting heroes that I knew a fair amount about, and so far I've been loving the MCU's take on him. Seriously, if any of you like and/or were ever interested in the character of Daredevil, then you need to watch this series. It's incredibly well acted and well written, and so is this story. Fine But Not Fine by Prepare for Trouble is a story that I'm actually upset isn't an actual episode of the show. It's that good. Taking place in between seasons 1 and 2, it's another typical day in court for Matt and Foggy, until Foggy goes to grab coffee from a street vendor, and then the vendor's cart explodes, the result of which blinds Foggy. With his friend trapped in a too bright and blurry world, Matt is pulled back and forth between trying to help and support Foggy, while also trying to track down the person responsible for the explosion, especially when he begins to believe that Foggy was deliberately targeted. And all the while, Foggy's inner strength to resolve is put to the test as he tries to get around without his eyes until his sight comes back. If it ever comes back. With plenty of both funny and dramatic moments that the show is known for, this story is a roller coaster ride of emotions from beginning to end, with Matt and Foggy's friendship once again being tested, but in a very different way. With the shoe now on the other foot, Foggy is given a chance to sort of experience the world the way Matt does and understand his friend better than he ever could before. Emphasis on the word sort of, because this tale also serves as a reminder that even though Matt's blind, his super senses still give him an edge and set him apart, while Foggy and other blind people in general don't have that advantage, a fact that even Matt tends to forget sometimes. "You okay?" Matt asked. Foggy breathed in again, slowly and calmly. It would pass. If Matt would just shut up, he would be able to get it under control. He reached for his beer, slowly, hand low to the table. Ironically, with the light so low, he could actually see better because he could stand to have his eyes open for any length of time without having to squint. "Foggy?" "Yeah, no." He took a sip of his drink. "I hate that I can't lie to you anymore. No, I'm not okay. I hate this. Is that what you want to hear?" "No." Matt sounded taken aback, surprised at the outburst. "Of course not." He took another sip and placed it carefully on the table in front of him. "Well, tough, 'cause there it is. I'm terrified and I don't know how to deal with it, because if I make this out like this is a bad thing, I'm insulting you and all the other blind people out there who know it's not the end of the world. And I know that too. It's just that right now I'm finding it really hard to remember it." "The only reason most of us know is that we had to find out the hard way," Matt told him. "Do you think I found it easy at first? Sometimes it's still hard." "Really?" He hadn't known that. Matt had never told him that. He laughed off every obstacle that society put in his way, took every frustration as a challenge, worked around the things that were important and pushed straight through the things that weren't, and never once did he give the impression that not being able to see bothered him. But then why wouldn't it? He had lost something precious. Learning how to live without it was one thing. Learning not to mind was something else entirely. "You never told me that," Foggy said. Matt didn't answer. Foggy heard the sound of ripping paper as the label was slowly peeled from a bottle of beer. "You should tell me stuff like that," Foggy told him. "I know I can't do anything about it, but you should still tell me." Suffice it to say, this plot has a ton of twists and turns. Just when you think you have the mystery figured out, another monkey wrench is thrown in that changes everything. Who's the bomber? Was Foggy the real target? And will he fully get his sight back? You'll just have to read and find out. Word of warning though, this is the longest story featured on this list, clocking in at a whopping 27 chapters with 2 epilogues. So yeah, you're probably not reading this in one sitting, but trust me when I say it's well worth it. And as for who's behind the bombing, all I'll say is it's a big surprise. And now, for the final entry on the list, let's take a look at a very short but sweet and interesting piece that I guess you could call a crossover, although does it really count as a crossover if the 2 characters in question come from the same universe? Ever since the Marvel Netflix shows first came on the scene, tons of fans were wondering if any of the TV show characters would make their way into the Marvel movies or vice versa. And while that's most likely never gonna happen, plenty of authors have written up like a zillion possibilities for how the Defenders and the Avengers could finally meet. But out of all of the ones I found, this one's my favorite. Defend the Orphan, Plead for the Widow by Trash Canal presents a scenario in which Steve Rogers and Matt Murdock first meet each other while attending Mass together. An odd little friendship is formed, and then things get interesting when Captain America gradually figures out he's been sharing a pew with Daredevil the whole time. Sharing a pew becomes a thing over the span of a month. During that month, names are exchanged and something akin to a friendship is formed. Matt eventually introduces Steve to the priest, Father Lantham, and the 3 sit down for lattes one Sunday after Mass. It's nice and informal, though Steve finds it a bit strange that Matt is so close to his priest. Maybe it's because he's a bit of a rehabilitated Catholic who only started regularly attending Mass as of recently. The other Avengers treat his newfound spirituality like an elephant in the room. Everyone knows where he disappears to on Sundays, but no one talks about it, and Steve isn't exactly sure if he should tell them about Matt. After all, his life doesn't just revolve around the team, even if it damn well seems like it at times, and he likes this new friend because it establishes a bit of normalcy in his life. So they go out for lunch, and for dinner, and they hang out at Steve's place in Brooklyn because the view from Matt's apartment in Hell's Kitchen is enough to blind anyone. Matt's never open about himself, but Steve gradually comes to string his life together from the little puzzle pieces he drops within their conversations. He now knows that Matt is an orphan, like him, who lost his father, like him, and fought against all odds to get to where he is today, again, like him. Even if he doesn't like talking about himself, it seems to Steve that Matt's life revolves around other people, namely one other, his friend Foggy. He tells them about their law firm, about their lack of paying clients, and their desire to make some sort of difference in the world, to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. In turn, Steve tells them about Brooklyn in the 40s, about picking fights with the neighborhood bullies, and Bucky. He doesn't leave out Bucky. What I really like about this little one-shot is its uniqueness. So many authors seem to get caught up in trying to make a first meeting between 2 characters this huge epic thing, typically happening in the heat of battle. Heck, even I'm guilty of doing it in my Blind Trust story that paired up Daredevil and Doctor Strange. And not that there's anything wrong with that, I just appreciate this rather different direction this story decided to take. Our 2 heroes meet each other in their civilian identities, pretty much accidentally, with both of them not knowing who the other guy really is at first, and as such they get to know one another as normal people first. So by the time the big "I'm actually a superhero" reveal happens, it's not really that huge of a deal for them. I love the comparisons that are drawn between Steve and Matt, similarities that even I didn't realize at first, but it's done in such an easygoing, laid-back kind of way that's a welcome breather from the usual chaos of the MCU. And I love how, rather than through some big reveal, Steve just kind of gradually figures out the truth about Matt, and it leads up to one of my favorite final sentences in a fanfic. I won't spoil it, but the irony it points out is hilarious. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this weird little video I've been meaning to put together for a while now, and I hope you can see where I'm coming from and just how annoyed I can get when people dismiss fanfic as something dumb and silly. It's another way a fan can express themselves and create more content for a fandom they like, especially if the material is lacking. These are creators who are spending a long time getting into characters' heads and making sure they're internally consistent, who write stories simply to share them with an audience who will enjoy them and doesn't add plot elements merely for shock value but because it suits the story they're telling, who play with tropes that are fun and entertaining and lighthearted and no less brilliant for it. Many published writers have even said that writing fan fiction is how they started, how they trained themselves to write better before publishing their own original works. Some of their characters are even repurposed fan characters they made up for a fanfic originally. I guess the point I'm trying to make is, fanfic writers, keep doing what you're doing, because what you're doing is awesome. Your stories are often what keep a fandom alive, or make someone happy, or open up new interpretations of famous characters that we all thought we knew but maybe didn't know at all. Most of all, I'll leave you with this. Not everyone can come up with worlds on a whim, or create characters that they grow so fond of that they're like real people, or just envision a story and then just write it. It takes passion and dedication. Writers, cherish your ability to create stories, because you don't know when or where there might be a person in the world who needs to hear your story. And to everyone else consuming all these stories, take heed. Fanfic writers are largely doing this for fun, as in they're not getting paid. A piece of writing that takes a few minutes to read could have weeks of work behind it. Don't take creativity for granted when you're getting it for free.